Alex?
Okay, great. Thank you, Hal, and thank you to all of you from everywhere except the Midwest for joining us this morning to talk about or to hear about the impacts of roadway and traffic characteristics on air pollution risks for bicyclists. So the content of the webinar today is kind of a mix where I'm going to be presenting an overview of the general state of knowledge in this topic area, and then interspersing into that results from the recently completed research project that was supported by NITC. So this is a research project based here at Portland State University, supported by NITC, also supported by the City of Portland and Portland Metro, our MPO here in Portland. And I'd like to acknowledge at the start here my co-researchers, co-authors on that work, Miguel Figliozzi, Jim Pankow, and Wentai Luo, who are all three on the faculty of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at Portland State University. So before I harp on all the risks for the next hour about air pollution for bicyclists, I wanted to start off with the big picture of health effects. So the point here is not to say that bicycling is an inherently unsafe activity. There have been a handful of studies looking at the net health impacts of an increase in active transportation. So we're talking about walking, bicycling, transit. And if we look at the health benefits of physical activity, they far outweigh the risks associated with traffic safety or air pollution changes. So most of the studies that have come out on this, which it's a fairly recent topic area, but we've been looking at an order of magnitude or even 2 orders of magnitude greater benefits than risks in terms of total net health effects. That said, there are still clear air pollution risks for bicyclists, and they're elevated when compared to especially people in motorized modes. So it is a concern, and I think we have a responsibility to try to mitigate those air pollution risks as much as possible, while at the same time encouraging more active transportation, because it is a net health benefit. So now, when we talk about the health effects of air pollution exposure during travel, I like to present this framework as the 6 steps connecting motor vehicle emissions to health effects for travelers. So we'll walk through these. So first of all, you have motor vehicle emissions. So these are a number of different pollutants generated through a number of different processes coming out of the on-road vehicles. In step 2, we have atmospheric chemical dispersion characteristics that lead to a certain level of air quality around a city. And so these are pollutant concentrations in a city that are affected by motor vehicle emissions. Now, if we want to look at exposure concentrations during travel, then we also need to know something about how, when, and where people are moving around the city. So that gets us to step 3, traveler exposure. But it doesn't stop there. So to take the next step, when we want to talk about get closer to health effects, we have to think about the inhalation rates. And this is particularly important in the context of active travel because we have to look at the breathing rate combined with the exposure concentration to know what the inhalation dose or intake dose is. But not everything that we breathe in is retained in our bodies. So when we're concerned about health effects, we really want to know not just what's breathed in, but what's absorbed in the bodies or retained in our bodies. And we can call that the uptake dose or pollutant uptake. And as finally, this is those uptake doses with a number of mitigating personal factors that are going to lead ultimately to the negative health effects. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about, primarily steps 3, 4, and 5 in these 6 steps. We're going to be talking about traveler exposure, traveler inhalation doses, and traveler uptake doses. So there you go. There's the first 3 points of the outline, exposure, inhalation dose, uptake dose, and then finally towards the end I'm going to, once I've talked about the state of knowledge and results from our recent research, I'm going to be talking about applications for transportation planning and design. So what are the takeaways for transportation professionals? So first, travelers' exposure concentrations. So we completed and published last year a comprehensive literature review on bicyclists' intake and uptake of traffic-related air pollution. And up to around mid-2014, there have been 42 studies published in which the researchers had directly measured on-road bicyclist pollutant concentrations. And here I've just shown the number of studies that have measured each of the 7 top measured pollutants. So we have 3 gases, nitrogen dioxide, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, and that's a whole group of separate compounds, carbon monoxide, and then the bottom 4 are 4 different types of particulate matter. So you have black carbon, which is essentially soot, and then coarse, fine, and ultrafine particulate matter refers to 3 separate sizes, from the largest to the smallest particulate matter. So these 42 studies have been conducted over since the earliest ones were in the 1970s, so over several decades, and also in a number of different countries, although they've been primarily focused in Europe. And if we look at the central values from these studies, we find very wide ranges, range over an order of magnitude or more. And these are the central values, not just the ranges within each study, but the central value from each study. And so you see that exposure concentrations are highly context dependent. So it depends on what cities they were measured in, what decade they were measured in, and also these had a range of different study designs. So sometimes the bicyclists were in mixed traffic, fairly large volume roadways, and in other ones the bicyclists were all on off-street bicycle facilities. So it's not easy to say just from the central values what's influencing bicyclist exposure concentrations. So if we look at the covariates of exposure that have been looked at, they tend to be focused on modal comparisons. So actually more than half the studies, the key research question is, how do bicyclists' exposure concentrations compare to other modes? So they'll measure it for bicyclists, pedestrians, bus riders, automobile passengers over similar routes, or typically for the same origin and destination. And while this provides some kind of scorecard information about how exposure concentrations compare across modes, it doesn't provide a whole lot of actionable information for transportation professionals who are looking to mitigate air pollution exposure for each mode. When we do look at the modal comparisons, we tend to get very context-dependent results. So if the bicyclists are utilizing mixed traffic roadways, their concentrations tend to be higher or similar to people in motorized modes on those same roadways. However, if bicyclists are provisioned with and utilize off-street facilities that are separated from motor vehicle traffic, then their exposure concentrations, as you'd expect, tend to be lower. One of the few things that has been fairly well studied, is high traffic versus low traffic bicycle routes. So this is one of the only determinants of bicyclist exposure besides mode that's really been looked at in more than 1 or 2 studies. And here what we're seeing on this slide is the increase in exposure for bicyclists on higher traffic routes as compared to low traffic routes for 6 different pollutants. And so you see that there's quite a range here. So for example, for volatile organic compounds, the median value was about double the concentration on high traffic routes, so 100% higher. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, PM10, which is the largest particulate matter, the coarse particulate matter, there was essentially no difference between high traffic and low traffic routes. And so the differences here among pollutants relate to the degree to which those pollutants are associated with motor vehicle traffic. So PM10 has more natural, non-traffic related sources, so we didn't see much differences for that versus more traffic-related pollutants like UFP or ultrafine particles, carbon monoxide, and VOCs. So into this context, we launched our research, and the key aspect of it is we wanted to develop more quantitative information linking roadway and traffic characteristics with bicyclist exposure concentrations, with the ultimate goal of mitigation. So finding ways in which we can reduce exposure risks for bicyclists. We as transportation professionals can reduce exposure risks for bicyclists. So we want to look at more of the intramodal determinants of exposure concentrations and uptake. So we conducted an on-road data collection. Here you see a photo of an instrumented bicycle. We had a number of different weather and air quality instruments mounted on the front of the bicycle. We're collecting location information with several GPS devices. We also had cameras looking at context information, and we were also, at the same time collecting some information about the riders. So we had some physiology monitors measuring things like heart rate and ventilation rate, breathing rate. And then we also collected, in the top right there, you see an air sample bag or a breath sample bag. So we collected exhale breath samples to do actual absorbed dose measurements. So we'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation. Here you see the sampling coverage. All the colored roads there indicate roads where we sampled. We purposely tried to get a very wide range of facilities around the city. So we were looking at everything from off-street bicycle paths there in yellow, low-street mixed traffic facilities such as the dark green, and then all the way up to the largest arterials we have in the Portland region, Powell Boulevard, Barber Boulevard, and Foster Boulevard. Those are the roads in appropriately red. So I won't go into the details of the statistical analysis, but we built a number of different regression models for different aspects of inhalation, exposure, and ventilation. And some of the key takeaways, here we're looking at VOC exposure models, so looking primarily at traffic-related compounds such as benzene, toluene. We found 2% increases in exposure on mixed traffic facilities per 1,000 ADT. So ADT is average daily traffic. It's a fairly ubiquitous indicator of average traffic conditions or the traffic volumes on a roadway. And it's very common. And it turns out in our analysis that even when controlling for a number of other factors, ADT seems to be a very parsimonious way of quantifying roadway characteristic impacts on exposure concentrations. And interestingly, this 2% per 1,000 ADT was very similar for VOC compounds as well as for carbon monoxide. We also found that in stop-and-go riding, so for example when the cyclists were in mixed traffic congestion or around intersections, that exposure concentrations were 20 to 30% higher. So there was a significant increase in exposure during stop-and-go riding, although that impact decreased on the higher traffic roadways. And then finally, for off-street paths, exposure concentrations on the off-street paths were quite similar to the lowest traffic mixed traffic facility. So off-street path concentrations were, on average, similar to roads with ADT under 1,000. However, for one specific segment of the off-street paths which went through an industrial corridor, concentrations were extremely high. In fact, 300% higher than the rest of the off-street paths. So that was an indication of the degree to which nearby land use can, so non-traffic factors, but nearby land use can influence exposure concentrations on transportation facilities. We also did some direct comparison of exposure concentrations on parallel paths. So we're looking at a major collector or an arterial facility and then a low traffic route or off-street path 1 block away. So in Portland, the city blocks are about 80 meters or 250 feet apart, the center lines. And so here we're looking at 3 comparisons of a larger traffic facility and a smaller traffic facility. And for all 3 of these, we found significant and large percent differences in concentrations between the 2 facilities. As you can see, carbon monoxide and VOC concentration differences on average between Ankeny and Burnside, Rodney and Williams, and Riverside, the Riverside Path and NATO Parkway. So these are further indications that even within an urban environment, there's a large concentration differences depending on the facility that you're using. Okay, but that's only exposure concentrations. And if we want to take the next step towards health risks, we have to also think about breathing rates so we can determine pollution inhalation rates. And so that's what we'll talk about here. So we know that ventilation, from exercise physiology, we know that ventilation or breathing rate in terms of volume per unit time is strongly related to energy exertion levels. So here is just an illustrative example of watts power output of an active traveler and the breathing rate. So we expect it to increase, and we expect it to increase non-linearly. going back to the comprehensive literature review, if we expand our study set to include studies that didn't directly measure exposure concentrations, but that use either modeled concentrations or previously measured concentrations, then there are 57 published studies that assessed bicyclists' exposure. And unfortunately, in the majority of those, ventilation was largely ignored. So the researchers were only looking at exposure concentrations, which we just talked about. In the rest of them, most used constant breathing rates for bicyclists. And the reason for that is because, once again, they were focused on modal comparisons. So these studies would say bicyclists are on average breathing at 3 times the rate of people in a bus, and then they'll do the assessment based on that static ventilation rate. Only 3 of the studies considered ventilation rate to be variable, and only 1 of those used directly measured ventilation on road. The other 2 used modeled ventilation rates. And even for these 3 studies, there was an analysis of the determinants of ventilation rates for bicyclists. It was really just used to get better approximations of inhalation and uptake rates. So clearly there's been a lack of analysis of the determinants of on-road ventilation for urban bicyclists. Here, still sticking with the literature, we can, for the studies that did measure on-road ventilation rates, we could look at the ratio of bicycle to motorized ventilation rates in those studies. And what we see, and here's plotted versus the average bicycle speed from those studies. And so what we see in the literature is, on average, about 2 to 5 times higher ventilation rates than people in motorized modes. And as you might expect, the higher the average bicyclist speed in that study, the greater the difference in exposure. So some studies were looking at fairly low-level bicycling, 5 to 10 miles an hour, and so for that type of bicycling, ventilation rates are more on the scale of doubled, whereas if bicyclists are running faster, then of course the ventilation rates are higher. And what that means for inhalation dose is if we compare bicyclists to people in motorized modes, such as cars, taxis, or buses, then those modes have much lower inhalation rates than bicyclists. So this is considering differences in exposure concentrations and ventilation rates. We see car, taxi, and bus modes much lower inhalation rates per trip or per unit distance than bicyclists. It's a bit more of a mixed bag when comparing bicyclists and pedestrians, because bicyclists have higher ventilation rates in general than pedestrians, but they also travel a little bit faster. So pedestrians have elevated ventilation rates when compared to motor vehicles, but they also are going very slowly. So their inhalation dose rates per trip tend to be higher than motorized modes, and they can be higher or lower than bicyclists. That's not very well determined yet. Okay, so as I mentioned, ventilation is one of the aspects that we measured in our research study. So we were measuring it with the physiology monitoring strap that measured expansion of the chest. And we found about 4 to 8% increase in ventilation rates per 10 watts of power output by the bicyclists. And this is similar to the physiology literature. But one of the more interesting aspects is we looked at the dynamic response of ventilation to workload. So considering the fact that bicyclists, energy expenditure varies quite a bit as they're moving around the transportation network. So it's not quite the same as a lab study where someone's going to cycle at 100 watts for 5 minutes at a time. So if we constructed a distributed lag model of ventilation as a function of workload, and we found a mean lag of about 50 seconds. So that means that the ventilatory response to changes in workload by bicyclists are not immediate, but they're spread out over 1 to 2 minutes. And this is important if we're going to look at detailed exposure and transportation system characteristics. For example, things like exposure hotspots at intersections, and try and relate that to inhalation rate hotspots. So even though, for example, at intersections, exposure tends to be higher, workloads also tend to be higher because bicyclists are accelerating. But that workload, that intense workload translates into a ventilation elevation, slightly down road. And then lastly, what we found is that, like I said before, ventilation rates are highly variable on road. So workload changes quite a bit. Ventilation rates changed quite a bit as well. And so using a static ventilation rate for all bicyclists can be quite imprecise in certain parts of the transportation network. Okay, so that was exposure, inhalation or intake, and now we're going to talk a little bit about bicyclists' uptake of air pollution. So there have been just 2 studies, previous studies, that measured bicyclists' uptake using biomarkers. There have also been a few more that modeled bicyclist uptake using a respiratory tract model. But 2 have measured it previously. One measured markers of volatile organic compounds in blood and urine of urban bicyclists and rural bicyclists. And they found, as you might expect, that urban bikers had higher biomarkers of VOC in their blood and urine. A more recent study was looking at induced sputum from transit riders and bicyclists in London, and they also found that bicyclists had higher lung-deposited or upper respiratory tract-deposited black carbon than the transit riders. So there's been a little bit of work in this area, but as you can see, not a whole lot of traffic or roadway-related covariates of uptake in these studies, really just looking at urban versus rural or bicyclists versus another mode. So we took a new approach in the transportation research arena by using breath biomarkers. So this is something that comes out of medicine where we can collect exhaled breath samples. And it turns out for certain types of compounds, for certain VOCs in the bloodstream, sampling their compounds in exhaled breath gives you a good proxy indicator of the concentration of those compounds in the bloodstream. Right? So we can look at changes in breath concentrations as an indicator of changes in blood concentrations for certain types of VOCs. And it turns out that this works pretty well for some of the traffic-related VOCs, such as benzene, toluene, or the BTEX compounds, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. So we collected exhaled breath samples from our bicyclists periodically over the course of a ride. And here you can see the sampling scheme. So we had prescribed sampling segments of about 3 to 5 miles, which took about 20 to 30 minutes to complete. And we designed these to go along transportation facilities with similar characteristics along the route, so kind of homogeneous segments. And we'd take a exhaled breath sample before riding the segment, monitor exposure, ventilation, environmental conditions along the route, and then take an exhaled breath sample at the end of the segment. So here, for example, is a local road segment, and then here is a segment along major arterials. So we can look at how breath concentrations changed as a function of exposure and ventilation during that sampling segment. And so the good news is that we worked. We found some significant changes, and this alone was exciting because this is the first application of breath biomarkers to travelers, and it allowed us to get some biomarkers of absorbed dose at a much higher resolution than you can get taking things like blood and urine samples. So we're looking at biomarker samples every, like I said, 20 to 30 minutes along the ride. So here, as an example, is toluene in exhaled breath and toluene in exposure air or ambient air during riding. And I've normalized both of these to the concentration at a reference park location, which we used at the beginning and end of each data collection. And as you can see, that concentrations of both exposure and breath are higher than at the park location, and they're higher on the larger traffic facilities. So major arterials concentrations are higher than local street arterials. In the statistical analysis, we showed that exposure significantly predicted breath concentrations, and the elasticity between them was about 0.5, meaning that changes in breath concentrations were about half as large as changes in exposure concentrations on each route segment. And we would expect it to be less than 1 because like I said, not everything that you're exposed to is being retained in the body. So breath concentrations are on average about 10 to 60% higher on major arterials after riding on major arterials than after riding on local streets for several different compounds. But if we subtract out background concentrations and look just at the impact of traffic on breath concentrations, the impact of major arterials was 3 to 5 times greater than the impact of local streets, meaning the breath concentration increase was 3 to 5 times greater for the larger traffic facilities than the small traffic facilities when we compare them both with the park location. So this was some of the first empirical evidence of absorbed dose differences by route type within a transportation network for any mode, actually. So we do have some clear evidence that route choice can reduce absorbed dose during a trip. We also did some slightly more complex statistical analysis. So here I'm going to try and summarize it because we wanted to determine the degree to which roadway and traffic variables were determining breath concentrations as compared to other factors such as just personal physiology or weather and background concentrations. So what we're seeing here is on the far left the explained variance in breath BTEX concentrations as explained by exposure concentration variability along the segment, as well as ventilation rate during the segment. So we found that a little less than half of the variance in breath concentrations of these BTEX VOCs was explainable from the measured exposure and ventilation. And so the other half was due to unmeasured factors or measurement error, things like that. Things like personal physiology. Okay, and then on the right, what we found is that if we, instead of directly measured exposure and ventilation, we modeled exposure and ventilation as a function of road traffic and weather variables, interestingly, we found that the reduction was only 10% in the explanatory power of the model. And so what we found is that even if exposure and ventilation aren't directly measured, if they're just modeled from roadway traffic and weather variables, those roadway traffic weather variables were ultimately quite strong predictors of breath concentrations. And on the far right, if we separate those two, looking at road and traffic versus weather, road and traffic were slightly more than half. So clearly, it's not just the environmental conditions, the external environmental conditions that are influencing these breath concentrations. Roadway and traffic variables do have a fairly direct influence on breath concentrations through changes in exposure and ventilation. Now, going back to the active transportation piece again, if we think about the effect that exercise has on uptake, what we found in our study, and this agrees with the literature, ventilation rates during bicycling are about 2 to 5 times higher than when you're resting or when you're in a motorized mode. So that means that inhalation rates of pollutants, given a certain exposure concentration, are also going to be 2 to 5 times higher. Now, what that means for particulate matter uptake from the literature, we know this means that PM uptake is at least 2 to 5 times higher for a given exposure concentration. So particulate matter uptake is proportional or even increases with exercise. For VOC uptake, on the other hand, we found that ventilation had a smaller impact on absorbed dose than it would for particulate matter. So what happens is essentially your blood reaches an equilibrium condition with the ambient air, and then you're only absorbing additional VOCs at the rate to which you're metabolizing them in your body. So you reach kind of this stable platform. Now that equilibrium condition increases with your ventilation rate, but it's not proportional. So instead of being 2 to 5 times higher, it's only 1.5 to 2 times higher. So this is a piece of good news in terms of the air pollution risks associated with active transportation, because for certain types of pollutants, for the VOC pollutants, the uptake rate isn't quite as bad as the intake rate. Okay, so that was a lot about the science of bicyclist exposure, inhalation, and uptake. Now we're going to try to focus a little bit more on takeaways for transportation professionals. So how can this information be used? Some of it directly and some of it more qualitatively as we're thinking about air pollution risks for travelers. So one clear application is route choice. So as I said, we did some direct parallel path comparisons, and we also did some regression modeling of exposure as a function of various roadway characteristics. And clearly, bicyclists can reduce their concentration by taking lower traffic facilities. Well, then the question becomes, well, is it worth it to go out of their way to take a lower traffic facility? So we did some modeling of inhalation dose per unit distance or per trip, and looking at when it's worthwhile to detour to a lower traffic street if you have to take a longer route. So as an example, for VOCs and CO, you can reduce your total trip inhalation dose probably through detouring to a low traffic street as long as the detour isn't more than 46% longer than the route along a minor arterial. If we look at a major arterial, there's more benefits from detouring, and so from detouring away from a major arterial, you can probably reduce your trip inhalation dose as long as it's not more than 123% longer. So essentially you can double your trip distance to detour away from a major arterial and still have a lower inhalation dose for the trip than if you had just taken the major arterial. And then when we were looking at grades, we used some of the ventilation and power characteristics from our bicyclists to calculate that inhalation doses for a given concentration increase about 20 to 30% for each 1% grade along the route segment. So one of the interesting pieces of analysis for me was we said, okay, well, for the detouring question, there's this trade-off where bicyclists can reduce their inhalation dose as long as they don't have to go too far out of their way to use a lower traffic street. Well, we thought, we know that bicyclists in general tend to go out of their way to take lower traffic streets, so how do these inhalation dose trade-offs compare with revealed preferences in the literature? So we used a bicycle route choice model that was actually developed here in Portland, here at Portland State University by some of the researchers in the College of Urban Studies, Urban and Regional Planning, and we used some of the parameters from their model to compare route preference trade-offs with inhalation dose trade-offs for routing. And we asked the question, will bicyclists naturally minimize their inhaled dose over a trip through their aversion to riding in traffic? So if we compare a low traffic street such as a bike boulevard or a neighborhood greenway with a bicycle lane, we found that if the bicycle lane is on a fairly small, fairly low traffic street, a collector street with say 6,000 to 10,000 ADT, that it appears that the bicyclist's preference trade-offs for distance versus exposure to traffic roughly align with the inhalation dose trade-offs. So for these types of facilities, bicyclists will tend to find the minimum inhalation dose route. However, if a bicycle lane is on a higher ADT facility, an arterial for example, then it appears that your average rider will tend to under-avoid that arterial facility. So the minimum inhalation dose route might be farther out of their way than they would be willing to ride to use the lower traffic facility. If we look at a minor arterial with no bike lane, then the situation reverses, and bicyclists will slightly over-avoid that facility compared to the minimum inhalation dose route. So the inhalation dose route might be along the minor arterial, but bicyclists prefer to detour out of the way, farther out of the way. And if we compare a low traffic street with a major arterial with no bike lane, bicyclists really don't like those facilities, so they're willing to go way out of their way, and in fact they'll probably have higher inhalation doses because of the length of the detour, if necessary, to use the low traffic street. And the point of this is not at all to say that bicyclists are making the wrong choices or that they should make choices solely based on a minimum inhalation dose route. It's simply to compare their preferences with inhalation dose trade-offs and see whether they naturally align or not. We also use the ventilation and power characteristics to look at the effect of stops en route on inhalation dose. And what you're looking at here is essentially the ventilation penalty of coming to a stop along a route and then re-accelerating back up to a cruising speed, neglecting any stop time. So kind of at say a stop sign where there's no cross traffic. And what we've done on the y-axis there is put the ventilation penalty in terms of distance. So this is the equivalent distance at cruising speed, which would lead to the same amount of ventilation. So you can kind of think of this as effectively adding that length to the bicycle trip in terms of the inhalation dose. And we found that there is a nonlinear increase because of the extra energy needed to accelerate back up to the cruising speed at higher cruising speeds. And for cruising speeds around 13 miles per hour, we found that in terms of inhalation dose, each stop adds roughly one Portland city block to the trip. So this allows, you could take this type of data and then make estimates of some of the pollution benefits of reducing stops along bicyclist routes, doing things like flipping stop signs on bike boulevards, for example. So there are clear inhalation rate benefits of reducing stops for bicyclists. Again, using the ventilation and power parameters, we looked at ventilation as a function of speed. So here you have two separate effects happening. We're looking at ventilation per unit distance now. So this is in liters per kilometer on the vertical axis. And you have two separate effects where at very high speeds, the power to overcome aerodynamic drag increases nonlinearly. In addition, you have ventilation increasing nonlinearly with workload. And so you have increases in ventilation per unit distance at high speeds. But at low speeds, on the other hand, you have travel duration effects where you're going slow, and so the duration of time that you're breathing to cover each kilometer increases. And it turns out that there's a minimum point, and that minimum point is roughly in the range at which people ride on city streets. So for our model cyclist here that we use, kind of the central value from our data, the minimum ventilation or minimum inhalation rate speed at 0 grade is around 11 miles per hour. Right? So going faster than that, and there's some inefficiencies because of excess workload, and going slower than that, there's some inefficiencies because of slower speed. And then if we compare the 0% grade to the 2% grade, we see that in general, at the 2% grade, they're breathing more, which would be expected because it requires more energy. But at the same time, the minimum inhalation speed is lower. So instead of around 11 miles per hour, it's just over 8 miles per hour. And so we actually constructed a minimum inhalation speed curve showing how the minimum ventilation speed is reduced at higher road grades. Okay, so the last couple slides here, I try to do even more generalization and came up with some guidance for how air pollution risks can feed into bikeway design considerations. So this is looking at several different types of bicycle facilities and thinking about how they will probably impact air pollution risks for bicyclists. And once again, kind of like with routing, I'm not at all saying that bicycle facilities should all be designed based on inhalation dose, but it is a consideration that is currently being neglected in most bikeway design manuals. And so this is some kind of summary information which can be used to inform the discussion and kind of feed into the whole decision about what kind of bicycle facilities we want to use. So for bicycle lanes and cycle tracks, those tend to be located on higher traffic facilities. And so right away you have a bad point in terms of exposure concentration. So higher traffic streets, as we saw, tend to have higher exposure concentrations. Bike lanes and cycle tracks do have some offsetting benefit due to lateral separation. And so there's a couple studies that have shown that, for example, for a cycle track, just moving it over 12 feet, just that lateral separation from motor vehicle traffic, has a significant and measurable benefit in terms of reducing exposure concentrations. That said, the exposure concentrations are still likely to be higher than the exposure concentrations on a low-traffic street, such as a bike boulevard or a neighborhood greenway. An additional benefit from inhalation dose point of view for these facilities is providing dedicated right-of-way to bicyclists. So as we saw, each stop within the transportation network has a clear inhalation dose penalty associated with it. In addition, stop-and-go riding around intersections, exposure concentrations tend to be 20 to 30% higher. So allowing bicyclists to navigate around motor vehicle congestion, for example, has clear inhalation dose benefits for both bike lanes and cycle tracks. Now, bike boulevards are expected to generally have very low exposure concentrations for an urban transportation facility. There are, of course, going to be additional benefits from traffic calming on those streets, keeping motor vehicle volumes low. And here again, fewer stops can reduce inhalation doses. For off-street paths, the exposure concentrations are expected to be low as well, similar to bike boulevards, and fewer stops can, once again, decrease inhalation doses. However, there's the big caveat on these that you have to be aware of the nearby land use, and off-street paths through heavily industrial corridors can have extremely high exposure concentrations, not traffic-related, but industry-related. And then finally, these are some more general takeaway principles. So just some things to think about in terms of educating professionals. There are many different pollutants. There are many different traffic-related pollutants even. And the health risks of them vary. The spatial distribution of them around the city vary, and as well as the uptake mechanisms vary. So in not all cases can we just say this change in the system is expected to increase or lower air pollution risks for travelers. There are many situations in which we might expect risks for one pollutant to go down and risks for another pollutant to go up. Traffic, weather, and land use are all important determinants of exposure concentrations. And so it's important to remember that while we might focus on one aspect of this, depending on what our perspective or profession is, these are all going to be important determinants. So we can do everything we can to reduce the influence of nearby traffic, but there's still weather and background concentrations we have to consider. But although there are a number of factors that influence exposure concentrations, there are consistently clear benefits of separating people from motor vehicle traffic. In terms of inhalation rates, bicyclist inhalation rates vary greatly with workload, which is determined by speed and grade characteristics. And we know that the breath response, if you're looking at detailed transportation system characteristics, the breath response is spread out over 1 to 2 minutes to changes in workload. And then finally, for uptake, particles, for uptake of particulate matter air pollution, it's highly sensitive to the breathing rate of the traveler, but for some gases, such as these aromatic VOCs we're looking at, uptake rates for them are going to be more sensitive to exposure and travel duration than it would be for particles. So for future work, as you saw, we've done some work trying to translate the more scientific findings into practical information for professionals. There's still some more work that needs to be done in abstracting these results so that they can be applied directly in health impact assessments and cost-benefit analyses. There's still more work that needs to be done in characterization of urban bicyclists. So we need to know more about traveling cyclists' physiology. We tend to have more data on athletes than travelers in this regard. And we also need to know more about their travel and speed choices. So things like how much do people slow down on hills and speed choices as they're connected to physiology characteristics as well. It's a natural next step to apply some of these same methods to study pedestrians, the other active transportation group, and in fact, larger active transportation group. So that is on the list of things to do. And then finally, I'll mention that there are a number of researchers, myself included, interested in crowdsourcing on-road air pollution data. And so on the right, you see a couple of photos from a device I developed and a screenshot of an accompanying app that allows travelers to monitor and track their personal exposure concentrations and physiology as they're traveling around a city. This is still prototype work, but I hope to use these types of devices to get more ubiquitous exposure risk information, as well as to engage active travelers in the discussion about air pollution risks. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. And I think I'll kick it back over to Hal, who's going to coordinate the questions. Is that right, Hal?
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Alex. That was a really interesting presentation, and it was good that you dug into the science behind the air pollution risks for bicyclists. So for those viewing the webinar, please feel free to continue to submit your questions if you have them. And we do have a few minutes remaining for questions, and I do have some for you, Alex. So you had talked about the important weather variables. Can you dig deeper into that? What are the important weather variables that affect exposure concentrations?
Sure. So in terms of weather impacts, it's definitely something that can't be ignored in these types of studies. So there's kind of two separate things going on. So one is the direct impact of wind and temperature and humidity on dispersing the nearby traffic emissions. And there's also this kind of background process of the pollution levels for the day, which is also influenced by wind, temperature, and humidity. So in general, in these studies, wind is always an important factor. So the more wind, the lower the concentrations, because wind basically just clears stuff out through advection. Temperature and humidity, in the environment, they're strongly related. So typically, you'll only see one show up in a regression model because they're so strongly inversely related. But temperature does have an effect on both the emissions rate of some of these pollutants and as well as their transformation rate once they're in the environment. So these are all significant. In our research, we included we had some background concentration measurements taken from the park location, and we used that. And even with controlling for that, wind and temperature were both significant as well.
Okay, great. And then as far as the traffic variables, did you measure more dynamic traffic variables in your study? You know, for example, hourly vehicle volumes?
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's a good question. We did. So ADT came out as like I said, a parsimonious indicator of exposure on a facility. We had 10-minute traffic counts from two control locations of the facility. So obviously we couldn't measure continuous traffic counts on every roadway in the network. So what we did was we used ADT as an indicator of facility size, so average daily traffic levels, and then we also added in these continuous traffic volume monitoring, both speed, volume, and density from the control location of the facility. So that was to control for the temporal variability in traffic levels throughout the day. But in the modeling, it turned out that the more dynamic traffic variables were not simultaneously significant once we were controlling for weather conditions as well and controlling for ADT. And so it appears that, I mean, we do expect there to be some temporal variability and exposure with changing traffic conditions throughout the day. All our data collections were during weekday traffic times, and so there wasn't an enormous amount of variability in traffic volumes. And in addition, the spatial variability appeared to be higher. So we were using a lot of different facilities, and so it appeared that the variability and concentration across facilities was larger than the variability and concentration within one facility.
Okay, great. So in your presentation, you did talk about land use and measuring exposure on a high volume, that exposure was high on one of the off-street paths through an industrial area. I know here in Portland, as well as in other areas around the country, you do see bike paths along highways. What were, and here in Portland, I know that there's a bike path along I-205, for example. So were the exposure concentrations not also high along those facilities as well?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we measured along, we had measured several different off-street paths, and they went through parkland, park locations, and there the concentrations were extremely low, some of the lowest that we measured. They went through an industrial corridor. Those were some of the highest that we measured. And there was also a bike path that goes along. It's basically in the I-205 right-of-way, which is a major freeway. And actually the concentrations on the near freeway bike path were not that high. They were similar to, I mean, they were smaller than any of the arterials that we measured. And there are a couple reasons for that. So one is the freeway has a large right-of-way, and so you have almost a full city block of lateral separation from the center line of the roadway and the bike path. In addition, there are long stretches, more than half of the bike path is behind a sound wall barrier. And there's been some research, actually some research here in Portland, showing that those can significantly reduce concentrations, essentially just shielding the riders from the freeway traffic-related pollution. And then thirdly, there's also, in that freeway corridor, there's very good dispersion characteristics. So the freeway is pretty out in this kind of open field, and so you're going to have strong dispersion from the winds, essentially blowing the pollution away. So it would be worse in, I know there's a proposed path through Sullivan's Gulch, for example, in Portland, and we would expect much higher concentrations there because the dispersion characteristics aren't as good.
Okay, great. Let me see. There is okay, so we do have another question from Wendell Knobloch, and he joined the webcast late, so he may have missed this. How much exposure to pollutants is there for car passengers in comparison to people on bikes? So on occasion, one hears reports of high pollutant exposure of people who travel in cars.
Yeah, so that's a good question. It varies by pollutant, and exposure concentrations, it varies by pollutant, it varies by the comparison you're making. So if you're going to put a bicyclist and a car passenger on the same road, and the bicyclist is riding in lane on that same road, then the bicyclist will probably have higher exposure concentrations. This is particularly true if people in cars, by rolling up your windows and putting the ventilation system on recirculation, you can keep especially particulate matter concentrations quite low. However, that's not necessarily the most relevant comparison because cars tend to drive on much higher traffic facilities than bicyclists tend to take. So looking at a more realistic mix of facility usage by each mode, the auto passengers will probably tend to have higher exposure concentrations than the bicyclists. So it really depends on the comparison you're going to make.
Okay, and so just to wrap this up, I know you are an avid bicyclist, Alex, and so this research is probably relevant to your everyday life. So how has your own research impacted your route choice or the amount of cycling you do? Because the science can be a little alarming.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. So it can be a little disturbing to know exactly what I'm being exposed to, but like I said at the very beginning, the health benefits of physical activity far outweigh the air pollution risks. So it certainly hasn't kept me from bicycling. I'm a little more conscientious about being willing to go out of my way to use lower traffic bicycle facilities, and if I'm behind the bus, I try to hold my breath a little bit until I get around it.
Yeah, and that's great advice. So, all right. Well, thank you everyone, and thank you, Alex. It was a really great presentation and very interesting, and lots of relevant stuff for us to apply in our everyday lives. So this concludes our webinar, and we are looking for your feedback so that we can continue to offer relevant webinars in the future. So be on the lookout for an email, and in that email we have a short evaluation survey, and we do use that information to figure out what types of webinars to host in the future. We will also be in touch with you with information about professional development credits, and you can view other professional development offerings on our website at www.nitc.us. And thank you again.